Before Keir Starmer was leader of the Labour Party, he helped an Israeli war crime suspect avoid arrest when they visited London in 2011. Joining me to discuss this disturbing episode is my colleague, John McAvoy.
Cheers, Phil.
John, you've been trying to get hold of emails from Starmer's time as Director of Public Prosecutions, which could shed more light on this crucial episode in his trajectory from human rights lawyer to what looks like Prime Minister of the UK, and a very authoritarian one at that. Talk to us about the article that you've published this morning on Declassified.
This is quite an interesting case where Tzipi Livni, who in late 2008, 2009 was the Israeli foreign minister and also a war minister during Operation Cast-Lead, which was kind of a brutal bombing campaign and a ground invasion of Gaza. I mean, it's very similar to what we're seeing today, in fact. So shortly after this, when Livni was no longer in government, she was the leader of the opposition. She visited the UK in October 2011. And just 1 month prior to her visit, the UK government had basically amended legislation on how they would go about universal jurisdiction proceedings. And it's quite clear that they made these changes to facilitate Israeli officials to visit the UK. Now, universal jurisdiction cases apply to basically serious crimes, war crimes, torture, and so on, committed by foreign nationals where they couldn't be arrested and prosecuted in a different jurisdiction under universal jurisdiction legislation. So there was an application for Livni to be arrested, in fact, in 2009. And that was accepted by the Westminster Magistrates Court, and so the arrest warrant was issued, but she didn't actually end up visiting on that occasion. So following this, there was an Israeli kind of diplomatic offensive to change British legislation on how these cases are approached. And in September 2011, under pressure from a number of the kind of Israel lobby organisations in the UK, the coalition government changed universal jurisdiction proceedings basically to facilitate Israeli officials to visit Britain without fear of prosecution. And what that meant was that the Director of Public Prosecutions at the Crown Prosecution Service would have to give their consent to any arrest warrant being issued under universal jurisdiction. And so in this case, when Livni decides in October 2011 to visit Britain once again, and one of the stated reasons for her visit was to celebrate this new legislation that Britain had passed. A human rights group, a Palestinian human rights group, and a legal firm issued an application to Starmer, who was then Director of Public Prosecutions, to issue an arrest warrant for Livni. And this was based on what they said was a comprehensive amount of evidence implicating Livni as foreign minister and as part of the war cabinet during Operation Cast-Lead, which the UN found had Israel had deliberately targeted civilians. And so what I've basically looked for is that the internal communications that followed this arrest application. Why did Starmer eventually refuse to issue an arrest warrant for Livni? And what were the kind of proceedings that went on behind the scenes?
For people who aren't familiar with Operation Cast-Lead in 2009, can you talk to us a little bit about the terrible cost on Palestinian civilians that operation incurred?
Richard Goldstone, who led a UN fact-finding mission shortly after the horrific bombardment, which killed around 1,400 Palestinians, over half of whom were civilians, around 333 children. So Goldstone found, and I quote, that the Israeli government's bombardment was a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize the civilian population, radically diminish its local economic capacity both to work and to provide for itself, and to force upon it an ever-increasing sense of dependency and vulnerability. So what the UN mission laid out here is that Israel was deliberately targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure.
How did you go about investigating this, John? I know you made a Freedom of Information request to the Crown Prosecution Service.
Many of the emails were withheld. All the ones that I actually received from the CPS following the Freedom of Information request were redacted, some of which redacted in entirety. And so, I went about this because I think it's quite an important case because, this was the first kind of test of the new universal jurisdiction legislation that Britain had implemented just 1 month prior to Livni's arrival. So I think it's important for the British public and for Palestinians who were victims of the Israeli bombardment to know precisely what actually happened behind the scenes. What happened in those 2 days between the request for the arrest warrant being issued and Keir Starmer eventually blocking it, eventually refusing to grant it. So what we need to know in this light is what discussions were had between Starmer and the State Attorney General's office, and whether the Attorney General tried to convince or encourage Starmer not to pursue the arrest warrant, because then we've got obviously a matter of political interference in the legal proceedings. In their final statement, the CPS said that this decision was Starmer's alone. So we need to know basically, despite being granted special mission status, whether Starmer was actually capable of issuing the arrest warrant anyway. So ultimately, Starmer claims that it was his choice, irregardless of the special mission status.
And this special mission status is something we've seen used more recently for Benny Gantz, an Israeli war minister who recently visited London to have meetings with David Cameron. So it's clearly something that's very useful for the Foreign Office in order for them to maintain these incredibly close relationships with an ally which is under investigation at the International Court of Justice for genocide. How much weight do you think we should place on this incident in kind of understanding Starmer's trajectory to where he's got to now, becoming this incredibly pro-Israel leader of the Labour Party?
Matt Kennard, one of our colleagues at Declassified, has done a ton of important work about Keir Starmer's record as DPP, his meetings with US judiciary officials, whether they had meetings with regards to Julian Assange's extradition. Obviously, Stefania Maurizi, Italian journalist, has done a lot of work on the emails that were destroyed by the CPS while Starmer was DPP with regards to the Julian Assange case. And Oliver Eagleton as well. I forget the title of his book. Apologies, the Starmer Project, I think. He goes into really impressive detail the extent to which Starmer has very much been an establishment man, despite him claiming that he's been a human rights lawyer and so on and so forth. And I mean, there's other cases that haven't really been very much looked into in Starmer's past. I mean, he represented Silvio Berlusconi at one point. So there's a lot of information about Starmer's past that wasn't really dragged up during the 2019-2020 Labour leadership election.
John, your latest article, Censored, Keir Starmer's emails about Israeli war crimes case, is available to read on our website. If you haven't already subscribed to this YouTube channel, please press the button below. And if you can, make a donation to Declassified from as little as £3 a month. That will help support the investigative journalism that John's doing into who is Keir Starmer, our likely next Prime Minister.